Tonight, the recession we couldn't avoid. After almost 30 years of growth, the pandemic sends the economy backwards. Good evening, I'm Juanita Phillips. This is ABC News. Calls for a police officer to be charged over the arrest of an Indigenous teenager in Sydney. Thousands take to the streets in the US for an 8th straight day of protests. And a crisis in regional New South Wales fears that some universities won't survive ongoing restrictions on international students. Economic Armageddon has been avoided, but the Treasurer says there was no escaping a recession. Josh Frydenberg today declared Australia's economy is officially shrinking. But he says given the devastating impact of the pandemic, bushfires and drought, the worst is yet to come. Political editor Andrew Probyn begins our coverage.
29 years after the recession we had to have comes the one we couldn't avoid.
Is Australia in recession today?
The answer to that is yes.
Josh Frydenberg didn't utter the R word, instead painting the grimmest of pictures.
This was the Economist's version of Armageddon.
In the first 3 months of the year, Australia's economy shrank by 0.3%, the first negative quarter since 2011. The year-on-year result, the weakest since the global financial crisis. The March quarter had it all.
Flood, fire, drought, and now the coronavirus pandemic.
The education and tourism sectors were struck first by COVID-19 when arrivals from China were banned in February. Tougher distancing restrictions in March forced the closure of pubs, cafes, restaurants and some shops. Panic buying at supermarkets didn't stop household spending plummeting.
Massive drop. Transport, hotels, cafes.
Australia's done well when you look overseas. Japan's contraction 3 times bigger. The United States economy down 1.3%, the UK 2%. Italy and France, which were also hit hard by COVID-19, both shrank by more than 5%, almost double that in China, where the virus first struck. But today's figures don't reflect the economic horror many are experiencing. The current quarter will be awful.
Far more severe than what we have seen today. But it's really a consumption story.
Treasury's expecting the economy to shrink 10% in the June quarter, bringing almost 3 decades of uninterrupted growth to a shocking stop.
This long run of growth was created by Hawke and Keating, it was defended by Rudd and Swan, and it ends under Morrison and Frydenberg.
Many Australians already know the brutal reality of this recession, and with unemployment to remain painfully high for quite some time, creating jobs will remain a challenge long after the pandemic has passed. To that end, employers and unions today held the first of several meetings to see if they can agree on how workplace laws can be changed to make that easier.
We all have to come into this process and be willing to make compromises.
We're going to approach it with an open mind. We're going to approach it in good faith.
A new era of consensus? Too early to tell. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
It was the slump in spending by consumers that really hit the economy hard. People also saved more, even as millions turned to government support. Here's finance correspondent Philip Lasker.
Kylie Gemmell and her partner Trent Glass were living their dream in regional New South Wales. But that turned into a nightmare when their accommodation business was hit by the drought, then bushfires and now the lockdown.
The tap was literally just turned off.
This year's income is zero.
As a business, it's definitely very worrying, and to be quite honest, I don't think that any business could have planned for the succession of disasters that we've had.
The economy was already pretty weak coming into 2020.
From mid-March, the pandemic and lockdowns pushed the economy off a cliff. Spending on services like travel, accommodation and hospitality plunged, while people panic-bought food and groceries. The savings rate rose sharply. Australians were scared or simply unable to spend as the economy shut down. Business and housing investment was subdued, highlighting concerns about construction jobs. Supporting the economy was government spending, triggered by the support payments needed following the natural disasters and lockdown. Trade was also a positive because our exports proved more resilient than imports, which fell sharply because the economy was so weak. These numbers are just the tip of the iceberg. 600,000 people have been thrown out of work and a large part of the private sector is on its knees. It means government support will need to remain in place for some time to come.
Elevated debt levels, low productivity, weak wages, all of that's still there when we come out.
Kylie Gemmell is hoping the worst is over as restrictions are eased.
People were just desperate to get away. I think everyone was sick of being in lockdown, and our bookings have been strong.
What could possibly go wrong? Philip Lasker, ABC News.
Disgust, shock and fear. Those were the emotions expressed today by the family of an Aboriginal Sydney boy who was tripped to the ground by a junior police officer. The family wants criminal charges laid against him. The Police Commissioner admits mistakes were made but says he believes people wouldn't want the constable sacked. That response has added to the growing frustrations felt by Indigenous communities. Here's crime reporter Mark Reddy.
Taking a knee, a symbol of solidarity in the United States, now one this Indigenous family can relate to.
What is happening in America has been happening in Australia for a very long time.
The sister and parents of an Aboriginal teenager want charges laid against this police officer. In this video, he's accused of wrongdoing.
You're police, you shouldn't be swearing at all. It's in America. I didn't say that at all, mate. Yes.
An argument follows and then this from the 16-year-old boy.
Cracking the fucking door, bro. What was that? What was that? Turn around if I can.
The officer moves in to make an arrest.
What? Oi! What the f***? Slammed him on the face. You just slammed him on his face.
Watching that as his older sibling, it's disgusting. I'm still in shock, really.
I felt very angry. And it kind of stirred up memories in my own life.
The arrest happened next to a playground in an inner-city park.
The officer was pressing on the young man's neck forcefully. You could see the kid was in pain.
I think I thought what most Australians thought, and that is we still have a long way to go in our country.
The boy was left with a chipped tooth. The officer has been stood down from his official duties. An internal police investigation will look at whether the force used by the officer was justified against the alleged threats of violence made by the teenager. The Police Commissioner, Mick Fuller, has apologised for the incident, saying it was a mistake and should have been better handled.
If there certainly is complaints sustained against him, you would have to say he's had a bad day.
What happened in the United States is not what happens here.
The teenager's family disagrees, so did hundreds of protesters who rallied outside Parliament last night.
And I truly hope this is a turning point within our community and with the police.
The family is considering a private prosecution in the event the officer involved isn't charged. Mark Reddy, ABC News, Sydney.
Thousands of protesters have again taken to the streets across America, defying curfews for an 8th night. But the demonstrations are now largely peaceful, even though the anger over the death of George Floyd continues. After Donald Trump threatened to bring in the military, the Pentagon has moved about 1,600 troops to be on standby outside Washington. There's anger over the president's response to the protests, but many Americans support his pitch to restore law and order. George Floyd's family has joined demonstrators in Houston, and in emotive scenes, the mother of his daughter has called for justice, saying he will never see his 6-year-old girl grow up. From Washington, North America correspondent David Lipson begins our coverage.
In America's capital, they marched on the Lincoln Memorial and were met by the National Guard. In Portland, thousands lay face down on a bridge to remember today's icon of black justice, George Floyd. All over America, countless thousands made their voices heard peacefully.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Even cowboys in Texas turned out for the cause.
I'm here today so she doesn't have to come back in 15 years for the same issue and protest again. So we want it fixed now.
Keep going. Keep going.
For those in charge, the first priority is restoring law and order.
Go! Losers.
A looting free-for-all in New York last night drew harsh words from the governor.
The NYPD and the mayor did not do their job last night.
Welcome to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. You're not burning down our city.
While in Idaho, locals were taking security into their own hands. The self-proclaimed law and order president stood for the cameras before a papal statue, but the presidential motorcade was booed as it returned to the White House. The clearing out of peaceful protesters for yesterday's photo opportunity has caused widespread outrage. Even ardent supporters of the president had blunt advice.
Seems like now is the time to say, I understand your pain. I want to comfort you. I think it's time we love each other. But the president took a different course.
Others saw it as a show of strength in a time of need.
It was strong and powerful for the president to go there and say, we will not be cowed.
The protest movement is getting political.
I promise you this, I won't traffic in fear and division. I won't fan the flames of hate.
Well, it may not look like it from what you can see here and at other protests around the country, but Donald Trump still enjoys a lot of support, particularly in the states that matter.
Black Lives Matter!
Even here, there are doubts about his opponent.
Would like to see him out of the White House, of course. But then again, I don't know who else is going to be going in the White House next. Could be somebody worse than Donald Trump.
As night drew on, there were more clashes at the White House and arrests in New York. The rage hasn't burned out just yet. David Lipson, ABC News, Washington.
In Minneapolis, the mother of George Floyd's 6-year-old daughter told protesters he was a good man. The state's governor has announced a human rights investigation into the entire Minneapolis Police Department. Chief Foreign Correspondent Philip Williams reports.
Gianna Floyd, just 6 years old, her father taken from her under the weight of a police knee.
This is what those officers took from me.
Gianna's mother, Roxy Washington, was mourning a future lost for a child and her father.
He would never see her grow up, graduate. He would never walk her down the aisle.
Her dad gone, his memory, his name, now etched in American history.
George Floyd! George Floyd!
Across the nation, countless thousands heeded the family's call for peaceful protests.
The families asked everybody to take a breath, just to take a breath for peace, take a breath for justice.
The Minnesota Human Rights Department has launched a civil rights investigation into Minneapolis police.
We're going to establish peace on our streets when we address the systemic issues that caused it in the first place.
The state's governor is resisting calls from the president to send in even more National Guard troops. And from the Minnesota National Guard itself, a promise to heed the call from protesters to keep it low-key.
We heard it, and we're going to stay back behind, invisible, so that you can't see us. Is that okay? Yeah, thank you.
That sense of cooperation between the protesters and the authorities has been seen in a number of cities.
Thank you.
But lurking amongst the thousands mobilising around the country is an unseen enemy. The risk of COVID-19 silently spreading through the crowds is frighteningly real.
I worry terribly about the peaceful protests. I see some wearing masks. I see some others not wearing masks.
One man's brutal death, one way or another, could cost many more lives in the weeks ahead. Philip Williams, ABC News.
The death of George Floyd has also sparked angry protests in Europe as anger builds over similar black deaths in custody there. In Paris, thousands of demonstrators defied police orders not to assemble due to coronavirus. They were marching to remember Adama Traore, who died in 2016 after being held down by several officers. In a show of solidarity with protesters in the United States, many kneeled and raised their fists. A number of people were arrested as rocks were thrown, fires lit and tear gas was used to disperse the crowd. Some universities in regional New South Wales warn they're on the brink of collapse because of the pandemic. A lack of overseas students means their funding is drying up. In Sydney, some universities are facing losses of hundreds of millions of dollars.
Bioengineers at Sydney University are leading the world in developing technology that will create synthetic bones, tissues and organs.
There's nowhere else where you can do this sort of research.
It stems from $18 million in federal and university funding and stands to make billions for the Australian economy.
We're bringing talents to Australia who eventually will stay in Australia, contribute to the progress of innovation and economy in Australia.
But fears around funding are ever present.
People are losing jobs, and there's a lot of researchers which, are having to switch fields now.
Australian universities expect COVID-19 will cost them $16 billion over the next 3 years. Some say it'll have a catastrophic impact on research.
Australia will just find itself a less wealthier place unless we deal with this shortcoming of losing a huge fraction of a generation of young researchers.
And it's not only the major city unis heavily reliant on international students that stand to lose the most.
It was a 10-minute bombshell where the Vice-Chancellor told us that the university was in terrible trouble and really that there was no way back.
Southern Cross staff have been told the institution is facing an economic crisis with an estimated $58 million funding gap over the next 2 years. Other regional universities too are facing massive shortfalls. Revenue is down at the University of New England, Charles Sturt University and Wollongong, which is expecting a loss of $90 million.
I've been on insecure fixed-term contracts for the last 3.5 years and before that as a casual. So now I've heard that this one is not being renewed.
More staff cuts at Wollongong are expected, and there are fears that smaller campuses on the south coast will be in the firing line. The federal government says it's already guaranteed half of the sector's revenue and is calling on the universities to focus more on domestic students, online education and industry needs. Antoinette Collins, ABC News, Sydney.
New South Wales has passed a major milestone with no new locally transmitted infections recorded in the past week. 15 coronavirus infections were diagnosed since last Tuesday, but all are travellers in quarantine hotels. 2 school children in Sydney's eastern suburbs were the state's last known locally acquired cases. New South Wales had no new coronavirus infections in the last reporting period. But it's a different story in Tokyo, where there's been a spike in coronavirus cases a week after a state of emergency was lifted. The city's governor issued an alert as the Japanese capital recorded 34 new cases in the last 24 hours. It's a marked increase from late May, when infections slowed to just a few per day. Around a third of the cases are linked to bars and nightclubs, which makes contact tracing much harder. The Tokyo alert means if infections continue to rise, residents could be again asked to avoid non-essential outings. Still to come this hour, how the recession is forcing people to move back in with their parents.
The business that I own stopped 100%, so no income, which is difficult.
It's evolved our relationship from being one where it's sort of parent and child to being on the same level.
The noise factor, the privacy factor, how does all that work? And every family will be different.
Plus, meet the Australians caught in America's protests. That's coming up.
A Sydney court's been told that a driver who allegedly crashed his car into a hijab shop in the city's southwest had a history of seizures. Sabri Nasser was today denied bail for a second time after he was charged with a string of offences over the crash at Greenacre last month. At least a dozen people were injured. A court heard the 51-year-old was involved in another collision in 2013, during which he had an epileptic fit and was unresponsive for 10 minutes. His case returns to court on Tuesday. The High Court has found the tear gassing of a group of teenagers at Darwin's Dondale Youth Detention Centre in 2014 was unlawful. 4 men, who were young inmates at the time, took their case to Australia's highest court after a Northern Territory judge ruled against them 2 years ago.
Locked in their cells as another detainee tries to escape an adjoining room. It's 2014 at the old Dondale's notorious behavioural management unit. Josiah Binsaris, Leroy O'Shea, Kieran Webster and another then teenage boy are inevitably tear-gassed, unable to escape their concrete cells as officers try to detain a then 14-year-old Jake Roper nearby. It was one of the many incidents at the Dondale Youth Detention Centre that sparked a royal commission into the Northern Territory's youth justice system.
The people that made the decision and did the gassing of these children acted unlawfully. It was wrongful and shouldn't have been done.
Today, 6 years later, the High Court of Australia ruled the gassing of the 4 teenagers locked inside their cells was unlawful. There were bystanders to the confrontation between Jake Roper and the staff of the detention centre playing out in the adjacent exercise yard. The use of CS gas on the appellants was a battery and therefore unlawful, the court ruled. A previous ruling by the Northern Territory Supreme Court had found the use of gas was reasonable and necessary, sparking the appeal to the High Court of Australia. The 4 boys in this case have already sued the Northern Territory government over their treatment at Dondale, receiving a combined total of $53,000 in 2018 over the use of spit hoods and shackles at the jail. But they were then also ordered to pay legal costs, which likely outweighed the compensation. Today's High Court decision paves the way for further compensation, ordering that a Supreme Court judge determines the damages owed to the 4 former detainees. Melissa McKay, ABC News.
A Melbourne judge has blasted 2 young men as she sentenced them to 10 years behind bars for attacking drug lord Tony Mockbell in jail. Tira Bennett and Eldea Twera are already serving time for serious violent offending. And a warning, this report by Danny Tran contains distressing images.
With a cell-sharpened shiv, Tony Mockbell was viciously stabbed up to 7 times by Tira Bennett and Eldea Twera, members of the powerful Pacific Islander prison gang, GFAM.
When you're 40, you see what GFAM and the bros do for you. You've never had a job, never had a stable relationship, no relationships with the children that you have. You will end up drug-rattled, lonely old men.
In February last year, a story about Mockbell, who's currently serving a 30-year sentence for drug trafficking, appeared in the Herald Sun, calling him an enforcer and saying he'd busted a Pacific Island extortion racket. The next day, in the moments after Bennett's own birthday party in the prison yard, he and Twera made their move, armed with crude prison-made knives, pouncing on Mockbell and another prisoner who tried to intervene.
The only reason you are getting any attention is because it was Tony Mockbell. But at the end of the day, you 2 young blokes, 2-on-1, mauled and maimed a 53-year-old man.
The ferocious stabbing left Mockbell clinging to life, and he was rushed to hospital for emergency brain surgery.
And you may think you're heroes within the jail, but do you think in 20 years' time that's going to matter?
Even though they dragged him to the brink of death, Tony Mockbell declined to give a statement to police, as did the men who stabbed him. Bennett and Twera were today sentenced to 10 years behind bars, where they're already serving time for serious violent crimes. And when he finishes his sentence, Bennett will probably be deported to New Zealand. Danny Tran, ABC News, Melbourne.
There could soon be a new verdict in New South Wales for crimes in which the defence is mental illness. The state government wants to replace the verdict not guilty by reason of mental illness with act proven but not criminally responsible. It says victims and their families made a convincing argument that the language should change.
This is about making sure that the criminal justice system respects the trauma and the pain of victims and their family members, recognises that the act has been done.
Legislation to create this new verdict has been introduced to Parliament. The Bushfire Royal Commission has heard that more extreme climate events could force emergency services to abandon some communities due to stretched resources. The Commission has been asked to investigate whether the federal government should have more control over bushfire emergencies. Currently, states and territories act independently. A key bureaucrat has warned a national approach is vital because more frequent natural disasters could lead to tough decisions about where to send resources.
that requires very safe governance arrangements to make those sorts of decisions, because the impacts on the community to which the capability is not deployed could be dire.
The commissioners say this inquiry is not about laying blame for what happened during the deadly fire season. On to finance now, and the markets shrugged off the news that Australia is in recession, with strong gains by shares and the dollar. Here's Alan Kohler.
Well, the markets have known for months that Australia would have a recession this year, so no surprise there. Today's action was a continuation of the view that the recovery will look like a V, which is what the Australian dollar chart looks like. The trade-weighted index is all the way back to where it was in January, which is 69.5 US cents and 62 euro cents. In fact, at one stage today, the exchange rate was nudging 70 US cents. Now, there are two specific reasons the dollar is rising. The iron ore price is up more than 20% in a month, and the US dollar is falling. More broadly, it's about optimism, which means all risk assets are booming, and that includes shares as well as the Aussie dollar, because global investors reckon it's all going to be okay. The All Ordinaries Index went above 6,000 today, led mainly by the banks and beaten up stocks like Qantas. The buy now, pay later firm Zipco went up another 22%, making it 67% in 2 days after it bought an American rival. And a little company named FBR, which stands for Fast Brick Robotics, went up 32% today after reporting that its bricklaying robot is now laying 200 bricks an hour, which is about twice what your average human bricklayer can do, apparently. Global markets were all higher last night and today. The iron ore price reversed 1% last night, while oil jumped 3.7%. And finally, here's a graph of per capita GDP, which removes the effect of population growth. It fell 0.7% in the March quarter, more than twice the fall in total GDP, and it's been in trend decline for decades. And that's finance.
Time for the weather now, and we're about to swap wind chill for morning frost, Graham.
Yes, and it's going to spread right through to the more eastern parts of Sydney and pretty much over most of New South Wales as well. But for Sydney, before we see that, we've actually got a couple of showers. They're developing at the moment along the very southeastern suburbs, so around the Cronulla area through to the city. These are with the front that's moving through the Tasman Sea. Now, there was a little bit of patchy frost about parts of the northwest this morning. Minimums dropped to 1.3 at Richmond. Our tops range from 16.9 to 19.6. Now, frost was mostly confined to the ranges today, especially the northern tablelands and the Snowy Mountains. It's been a generally dry and mostly sunny day, although we have had some areas of cloud, and maximum temperatures for most of the state sat within about 2 degrees of average. There's a high pressure system over the west of the state. It's in a weakening mode, but another high in the Bight will strengthen, and that will see an easing of the winds. That's why we're expecting to see fairly widespread potential for frost over the coming days. Now, late Friday, the eastern high pressure system dissipates, but that Bight high will dominate the state through the weekend. But what it will also do is maintain a southerly wind flow, and that could lead to a couple of possible weekend coastal showers. Now, frost warnings have been issued for parts of South Australia and Victoria. We've got widespread frost in Tasmania as well. It'll even reach into the southern inland of Queensland. And the frost will become more widespread tomorrow morning for New South Wales as lighter winds allow overnight cold air to settle. We've still got that hazardous surf along the coast, although it will start to ease in the south. So in the northeast, frost on the tablelands and also the upper Hunter with the partly cloudy to sunny day. A possible isolated coastal shower between about Nelson Bay and Port Macquarie. And strong southerly winds will continue on all the waters. We've got some widespread frost on the tablelands and the coastal ranges. It should be a dry and mostly sunny day to follow though, and we are looking at generally light winds, although we have got strong winds south of Point Perpendicular offshore, but they'll be onshore as well through the Illawarra waters. Now, frost for most of the slopes and the plains, but they're less likely further west. We've got dry and sunny conditions with mostly light winds forecast. And for Sydney, the strong winds on the coastal waters will continue, so will the hazardous surf. We've got overnight lows ranging from 3 to 11. Our tops should reach about 15 to 18. It should be a dry day, although partly cloudy, and moderate south to southwesterly winds. And so south to southwesterly winds will keep the minimums just that little bit warmer tomorrow, but they really drop from Friday all the way through to Sunday. We're looking at widespread frost, particularly around the Richmond area, where we could see temperatures dropping to sub-zero. As we roll through Sunday and Monday, a possible coastal shower, but for the most part, most of New South Wales looking at a dry long weekend.
Thanks, Graham. Lee Sales is here now with 7:30.